Hello, and welcome to today's Bridges to Community show. My name is Sarah Turcott, and I work at Bridges by Epic at Westford.
And I'm Erica Lab, Executive Director at Bridges by Epic at Westford. Welcome to Bridges to Community. For today's show, we are so excited to welcome our special guest, Jody Gastfriend. She is the author of the very personal, thoughtful, and helpful book, My Parents' Keeper: The Guilt, Grief, Guesswork, and Unexpected Gifts of Caregiving. Jody is a longtime social worker and with an extensive and impressive resume, running the gamut from hospitals to home care. Currently, she is Vice President of Senior Care at Care.com. Jody is not only a professional in the field of senior care, but has lived this personally as she navigated the caregiver journey for both her parents while juggling busy life of family and career. Welcome to the show, Jody.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
We're so happy to have you to talk about this wonderful book that we love so much.
Oh, thank you.
So welcome.
We're so happy to have you. It really is a wonderful book, which we're going to talk, obviously, on today's show. And just getting started, your book, My Parents' Keeper, is a book about caregiving. And I didn't know if you could just share a little bit with our audience about caregiving, maybe some statistics here in the U.S.
Sure. Well, there are roughly 40 million family caregivers in the United States. And even that term, family caregivers, is a recent one. Right. When I was caring for my dad with dementia 20 years ago, people didn't even have the language to describe what the experience was. And it's important because often people feel very isolated. And many times caregivers are not prepared for the complexity, for the challenges, for the costs, for all the family dynamics that come into play. So my passion has really been providing people with resources, with information, with sort of a compass about how to approach this caregiving journey, even though everyone's experience is going to be different.
Right, and so that was sort of sparked by your experience, that drive to connect people with, resources.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
That's wonderful. So what are some of the challenges that people face when caring for a family member specifically? I mean, I know you know firsthand, but also from your vast professional experience. So can you explain to people who may not know or maybe just learning, what are some of the challenges for people?
So, there are so many challenges, and I had mentioned before that people are not prepared. And, one of the ways that people are not prepared is that they don't understand the landscape. And it's really quite complex. The different types of care, in-home care, senior housing, there's assisted living, then there's nursing home care and memory care, and people are not sure, how do you find the right care for my mom or my dad? How much does it cost? Who do I ask? People just Google information and sort of get lost on the internet. And at the same time, many caregivers are working. So they're juggling the experience of being a family caregiver for a parent or a grandparent or maybe even a spouse or other family member. They're in the workplace trying to keep their focus on the job, and was my experience. Many of them have dependent children, and that's what we call the sandwich generation. And they are really not able to figure out, how do I navigate all of this?
Right, and we always say when we're working with families, it's a shame that they don't teach this in school, because almost all of us will have to deal with this, and most people never even think of it until they're already in the midst of it, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, and another interesting statistic about caregivers, I'm a member of the baby boom generation, and we are turning 65 at a rate of 10,000 people a day. Wow. And we are starting to age out of being the caregivers, and some of us are aging in to being cared for. Right. And caregivers are actually getting younger. 50% are under the age of 50, and 25% of family caregivers are millennials.
Yeah. Wow.
And I actually wrote an article recently for Forbes about millennial caregivers. I interviewed them, and can you imagine what it's like to be in your 20s or early 30s, all the things you're trying to figure out in life, and many of them are spending more than 20 hours a week in caregiving responsibilities.
Wow.
So really feel very strongly that it's very important to be able to provide resources to all the different generations who may approach caregiving differently.
Right, and then the economic impact, especially for that group. You know, the baby boomers are in a very different socioeconomic situation, you know, overall.
Right.
You know, not to globalize, but than the millennials. Certainly.
And many are reaching into their own pockets to pay for care, and the millennials, that is about 1/3 of their income.
Right.
Is typically spent on caregiving. So, and they're very devoted. You know, when I spoke to them, you know, they actually have a lot of gratification, as most caregivers do. But the worries about how you're going to, you know, manage your career, find time to date, hang out with friends, can be particularly difficult for that age group.
Yeah, all while trying to provide the very best for the person you love.
Exactly.
So with all of the stuff that a caregiver juggles, is there any advice that you can give to, you know, how can people prepare to be a family caregiver?
Yeah, so that was really the impetus for the book. And you know, I think that when you are faced with caregiving, most often what happens, it's a crisis.
Yep.
There's an event.
Right.
With my father, it was slower because he had dementia, and we were gradually seeing the signs, but when we got the actual diagnosis, then reality really hit us hard. So what happens when people are faced with that crisis is oftentimes they make decisions based on limited information. So to prepare, it's really learning the landscape. And what does that mean? Well, number one is, what are the different types of care, as I mentioned before? What are the costs of that
Which
care?
you have at least a whole chapter in there
I have
dedicated
a whole chapter
to that.
about the different types of care. And even when you're talking about home care, there's non-medical home care, there's Medicare certified home care. A lot of home care is paid for out of pocket. A lot of people don't know that.
Right, which is why in the book you call it a care maze, because it is. It's a maze for people, specifically for people that aren't, I mean, you found it challenging enough that you wrote a book, and you're a professional. So for the families at home that are watching, when you're a layperson, it's even more confusing, because you may not even know the difference between Medicare and Medicaid.
A lot of people don't,
Right.
and I make that point. And there's actually a really big difference.
Right. Sure is.
And Medicare typically, as we know, doesn't pay for long-term care, and that comes as a big shock for people,
Right. Yeah.
especially when they're facing nursing home care and they think, oh, you know, it's $90,000 a year and Medicare will cover it. Well, no, it won't.
Right.
There's some tremendous resources that many people also don't know about, and I'm sure you've heard of the AAAs, the Area Agencies on Aging, that cover the United States. They're mostly free advice and information and resources that people can access by going to the eldercare.gov website. And there are also programs that are state-specific that might help frail elders who are at risk for going to a nursing home, who might otherwise be able to be supported in the community.
Right.
So I often direct people to the resources like the AAAs, like the Alzheimer's Association, like the Caregiving Action Network, and I list those in my book so people can go to the right websites where they're not being sold to. They're actually getting objective information about how to figure this all out.
And Sarah and I, especially Sarah being in community outreach, we do a lot. We're still learning of organizations that can be helpful in sort of vetting them and then using them to guide families in the community. And this is our full-time job. And we still are learning and trying to find different resources for veterans benefits or, you know, Medicaid applications or all these things that luckily there's much more out there than there was 20 years ago when you were needing the help.
And it's changing all the time. And you mentioned veterans benefits. This is something many people don't realize can significantly help you with long-term care.
Even spouses.
Yeah, even spouses. So my father was in a nursing home for 2 different nursing homes for 6 years. And after 3 years, we were paying privately, and my mother was very nervous about the cost. So it turns out he was a veteran, and we went through the paperwork to apply for veterans benefits. We got him on a list for the Soldiers Home in Massachusetts, and he eventually did get a bed, and we did transfer him. Now, the difference in cost was $90,000 a year, and it would be more now, versus $9,000 a year.
Gosh.
So, you know, having that knowledge and resources and figuring out how to make it all happen made a big difference, and he did well in that.
Right, and sometimes
facility.
it's spending a little bit money up front with a geriatric care manager, which you mentioned, and getting to the resources to save a whole bunch of money on the end.
And we often tell people we refer people to elder law attorneys because they really understand the long-term care funding, which again varies from state to state, and Medicaid will pay for nursing home and other types of care, but you have to understand, are you eligible? Do you need a spend down? How do you transfer assets if you need to do that? So this is an area of complexity and specialization that you need to find the right expert.
And we had an expert recently on the show, and it was eye-opening for us, specifically when working with spouses, because the laws are a little bit different for partners. And so now we have this great resource that we can send folks to, because the spouse says, well, what about me? Which is a great question to ask when you're caring for a loved one.
And the spouse is often the caregiver.
Right.
So, and spousal caregivers are more likely to be isolated, less likely to reach out for help, and more prone to depression and chronic illness. So that's actually a category of family caregiver. It's very, very important to reach, because they're often doing the hands-on physical care as well as the emotional support, as well as all the logistics.
Yeah, and you actually mentioned that a lot in your book, is the toll that caregivers the toll caregivers do take. And you know, you're saying, you know, the education is power. You know, it's definitely a huge tool, is to get that education and the right resources. But what other advice can you give to caregivers who may be experiencing caregiver stress, or just, you know, the daily ins and outs of being a caregiver? Can you shed
I
some
love this
advice
part
on
of
that?
your book.
Yeah.
I just found like it was so different.
What can they do to take
Well,
better
I
care of themselves?
shared my own experience, and when I was going through it, there was not so much of a conversation about caregiver stress, and I was sort of in a mode of just get through the day, do all the things you have to do, and collapse. And whether it was my kids or my dad or my job, and eventually, you know, I talk about having suffered from chronic migraines the time I was 16. My headaches got worse, and it was really my doctor who kind of said to me, "You're doing too much." And at first I was annoyed by that, but it forced me to step back and say, this isn't working, something needs to change. I actually did adjust my work schedule, and I was fortunate that my mother was the hands-on caregiver, but I also really wanted to be there for my dad. And research shows that caregivers are very vulnerable. They're emotionally vulnerable, they're vulnerable to chronic illnesses, they are more prone to addiction, and they're less likely to seek preventive care. But the whole premise of my book is that there are ways to care for yourself too, and open yourself up to the many benefits, not just the burdens of caregiving. But for that, you have to be very intentional about how much you can take on. And caregivers often say, oh, it's just one more thing. I'm just doing this. I'm not really a caregiver. I'm just running errands and doing the grocery shopping and the medication. And then the list keeps going.
Not even giving themselves enough credit.
Right. And you know, I often say that self-care is not a luxury, it's a discipline.
I loved how you put it in the book. Like it's not necessarily like a spa day, like and that and it really rung for me as often a presenter on, hey, caring for the caregiver, you know, make time for yourself, pencil yourself in, and it really was like, oh man, you know, the way that in the book when you sort of balked at the doctor when he was like, oh, well, you're doing too much, and you're like, really? Yeah. Thanks, doc. You know, like I know
something I don't know.
but I don't have a choice here. In that finding meditation for you is something. It's like, you know, something that doesn't take a lot of time out of your day, but the impact of it is really great. But that got me as a provider really thinking about what we're asking of caregivers when we say to make time for yourself. What does that really, what can that look like? And what does it truly mean? Not, you know, not necessarily get your nails done, you know, it's like.
And it's also outsourcing, that realizing, okay, there are things that are on my plate now that other people can help with. And there's a whole chapter about siblings.
Right.
And that's a whole other topic. Sometimes I was fortunate, I have a brother and sister, and we're constantly, even now with my mom who's needed some care recently, my brother will take on something, my sister will take on something, I will, and then we'll switch off because we need a break from that task.
That's great.
Yeah.
But a lot of times siblings are not on the same page. So if siblings are not either available, then you need to look at other types of resources, whether it's paid help, volunteers, and dealing with, saying no. I mean, sometimes people feel like they have to do things as perfectly as possible. One of the first chapters in the book is the Imperfect Caregiver. It's really recognizing that sometimes you just kind of have to settle for good enough.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's really hard when people feel like, well, my mother doesn't want a stranger in the home, or my dad wants me to do this. And, and I gave a number of examples where caregivers felt that way, that only they could do things the right way to make their parents happy. And when they hit the wall and they couldn't do it anymore and introduced help and it clicked, that they were freed up to be able to care for themselves.
Yeah, and I think like that letting go. So part of have to allow your siblings to help in one way or another, and you have to let go of the control, which is something we talk about with families moving in. It's like, they're holding on so tight for a myriad of reasons, great reasons, but if you want to change both lives, both your life and the life of your loved one, it's like, it's time to let go and to trust and to take a little bit of a risk.
Right.
But what's the alternative?
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot about when you're talking about changing your caregiving situation, either moving to a community or introducing in-home caregivers. There's a lot about the emotional connection that really makes a difference. I interviewed a number of family caregivers who said, under no circumstances would my family member ever accept a caregiver. One example was a former CEO who was used to being in charge, as you talk about, and he had dementia, and the family could not manage it. And every time they introduced a caregiver, the caregiver got fired.
Right.
And eventually, they had the idea, they stopped calling the person a caregiver, they called her his assistant. And they found someone with the right personality, the right skills, so that I think from his perspective, it wasn't an assault on his identity, and he didn't feel that he was relinquishing all control. And that's important, to give people the ability to hold on to some of that self-determination, that control, that identity. And of course, the area that often is the most stressful is driving.
Oh yes, that is a hard one, because it's really, you think about culturally, it's really a sign of independence when the kid turns 16 or 17 and they get their license.
Exactly.
Of course, that's all changing now too, but with Uber and everything,
Right.
But, your freedom, and so taking that away, and so much of elder care is a taking away of things.
But it doesn't all have to be.
It doesn't have to be.
And
that's
that
right.
is really the point of my book. I mean, my mother's a good example. She moved to an independent living community that also has assisted living, and she recently had a health crisis where she needed 24/7 care.
Right.
And we were fortunate that she was willing to accept it. That's the first hurdle. But she also found some gifts. Her children were coming more often, people were calling all the time. As hard as it was, there were things that she was able to take from that. And now that she's feeling better, it's even more sweet for her, and the gratitude is more pronounced. So I think it's really being able to look at both sides and not just the losses, but what can you gain, even with a devastating disease like dementia.
Right.
Yeah.
And can you connect the dots there for you personally, when you were a caregiver, ways that you were in the moment or appreciated the joys of caregiving? We know the stresses, but talk a little bit about what you were able to do to help yourself, the tangible things for your own care.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, my father, I think we were fortunate that he never lost his sense of humor. And
he actually had a mistress.
Oh,
right?
he had,
like
yes. I wrote an article about that. That's actually in Oprah, and it's called "Why I Loved My Father's Mistress," and it's kind of a catchy title.
Yeah, that's pretty eye-catching. But a little bit of a clickbait there.
Yeah, it's a clickbait. You know, he used his imagination a lot as a way to cope with dementia. And that was a gift.
Right.
So my mother often went to imaginary places with him, and he loved music, and my daughter would sing to him. And the idea of this imaginary companion / friend, mistress, whatever she was also a gift, because it made him less alone and made us feel less guilty about leaving him alone. Right. So, you know, there are remarkable ways that people can cope with dementia, and I think we focus on all the things that are lost, and there's a lot that's lost. But there are aspects of people's identity and personhood that are still very much there. Yeah. And one book that I recommend and cited in my book is a book called I'm Still Here by John Zeisel. And I think it's really helpful for caregivers to read that, because it allows you to look at the person and say, well, they don't know me, they don't remember my name, they don't know what's going on. And it gives you tools to connect with the person that's still very much there.
Because they're still in there.
Right.
You just got to connect. You got to find them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true.
So I want to kind of go back a little bit, if you can, to talk about folks who are caregiving and still trying to juggle the work life, the workload, the work life. And is there any advice that you can give to people who are still in the workforce and finding themselves in a caregiving position?
Yeah, and that actually, my experience, which kind of propelled me to the work I'm doing now, is that I was in the workplace. There were really no supports. Right. For elder care. There was for child care. And one day I actually did bring my dad with dementia to work with me, which was kind of a crazy idea. Yep. But you know, he didn't wander, and he could sit there for a few hours, and I thought that's not a sustainable solution. Right. There must be other people in my boat. And that eventually led to my work at care.com, where we have a suite of benefits to support caregivers in the workplace, from child care to senior care and pet care as well. And it really allows people to be present and focused as best they can and have the supports and resources they need. And I think the acknowledgement of working in an environment where they say, we understand it, you don't have to hide, you don't have to pretend you're not in this situation. We have put in place supports, whether it's backup care or expert guidance, which is the benefit I created, or access to caregivers and resources. So I think the first thing to do is to figure out in the organization that you work, what type of benefits are available. Speak to your manager and your human resource department. If there aren't any, maybe you could be the advocate for putting them in place, because if you're having this experience, chances are some of your coworkers are also experiencing caregiving challenges and may be afraid to speak up. It's also important to know what is available to you. There are times where people have to take an extended period of time off. You have a parent with a terminal illness, you are a long-distance caregiver. I gave an example of someone in my book who was relocating his parents across the country. And then you may want to take what's known as an FMLA, a family medical leave, which allows you to take up to 3 months off your job, and have your job secure. And there are a small number of companies that actually provide some kind of pay during that time, both for child care and senior care. And there's a handful of states actually that have put in place some type of paid FMLA.
And Massachusetts is moving in that direction.
It's moving in that direction, yeah. So that to me is very encouraging, because we've really come a long way in the 20 years that I first experienced it. Flexibility is one of the biggest things that people need. And I talked to caregiving employees who had the flexibility they need and were able to stay at their jobs. And I also talked to people who had managers who were completely insensitive to what they were going through, and sort of dinged them for being late or having to leave early, and that eventually leads to people having to leave the workplace. And we really try not to have people do that because the loss of income over a lifetime is around $300,000 for people who leave the workplace altogether. And employers also face a loss because they have employees who either are not productive, not engaged, and really not able to do their jobs in the way they might otherwise. So it's a win-win to support caregiving employees, in my view.
I want to change lanes. We don't have too much more time, but one of the things we really appreciated about your book was you talked about caring for people even when the relationship hasn't been that good. And even in the best of circumstances, relationships can be complicated, but often we come across family members who are caring for someone where the relationship has maybe been abusive or challenging another way. Can you just speak a little bit to that piece of your book?
I felt it was really an important chapter to write because so often when people talk about caregivers, it's out of devotion. I want to give back. My parents were so amazing. I want to care for them. Well, that's not the case for everyone. It is the case for some, but I talk to caregivers who experience all types of abuse. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, and some were abandoned by their parents. Some had parents with mental illness, substance use disorders, all sorts of mental health challenges. And there's no right or wrong in this situation. It really depends on the individual. There are some who chose to assume a caregiving role, and many of them found it healing. They weren't able to undo the damage that was done, and that's not a goal. But they were able to see their parents as vulnerable, flawed people with their own history of abandonment and abuse. And for that, they were able to step away from a cycle of hurt and anger, and many found that very freeing, and many were able to redefine their relationship with their parents. Not that they became, really close, but they were able to understand their parents in a different way. And some also felt like it was too toxic. They couldn't do it, and they had to walk away and find other resources. And there's no judgment for either of those choices, but I think people have to understand that there's support. If you are a caregiver going through that it's important to get help either through therapy or support group or talking with people who've done it.
And that you actually have choices.
And you should honor those choices and recognize that whatever journey you choose to take, that is what is really best for you and your family.
Well, this has really been great having this time with you, Jody. And before we wrap up, is there anything else that you may want to share with the audience?
Well, I think the important thing as a family caregiver is to realize that you're not alone. There is help. And it's good when you're not in a crisis just to learn about this, to be curious, to have conversations with your family members. Many people avoid conversations about money, about end-of-life care. There are a lot of resources I name in my book, but it's not one conversation, it's a series of conversations. And if you reach a brick wall and parents want to have that conversation, have it with other family members. But try to have a team in place, because the more support you have, the more resources, the more understanding, the better your outcomes, and the more able you will be to experience the benefits amid the burdens of caregiving.
Thank you.
True. Such great advice. Well, thank you so much for
Jody
being
Gastfriend,
here.
My Parents' Keeper, The Guilt, the Grief, Guesswork, and Unexpected Gifts of Caregiving. Amazon, Young University Press. Wonderful book.
And thanks for joining us. Until the next time, take care.